Now today we're going to take a look at how to give a running record assessment. If you remember the other day we worked on guided reading as one of the centers in the Essentials of Literacy classroom. When you put students in an Essentials of Literacy program, the center that they attend, guided reading, you can't place students in that guided reading center without knowing what their proper reading level is. And the instrument that we use to find the proper reading level is to do a running record assessment. If you remember the other day, you took a look at the level text, and then what we had is a running record monthly summary sheet for every student. And what I want you to do when you have an Essentials of Literacy classroom is the teacher who's in charge of guided reading, as part of that station, to take a running record on a student every day. If you take a running record on a student every day, then you'll have a running record per child, one every month, and we want to keep the monthly running records running. Why do we do a running record? We do a running record because we want to find out what kind of progress a student is making. We can't move them from one level to the next just on teacher judgment. We need to see what kind of errors they're making, what kind of comprehension the child has intact when they're reading. Okay, let's take a look at what a running record actually is. What we do when we take a running record, it's really a systematic approach to record a child's behavior while they're reading. And the main points of why we take a running record are to monitor the progress that each child is making. Very important to decide what text is appropriate for that child, because we are always teaching the child at their instructional level. And today what you're going to see when you take a running record is that we're looking at 3 different levels: their independent level, their instructional level, and their frustration level. And we need to teach to their instructional level. The next very important thing is we need to keep a record of change over time. And as I mentioned, I want every child to have a running record folder. This should be one of your filing systems that you have. And as you take your monthly running record, take a look at what the child did from one month to the next to see what kind of progress they're making. The next reason we take a running record is we kind of take a look at the level of text difficulty. And when we're looking at that, we want to find out we want to make some critical decisions about the child. And of course, the last thing is we want to keep our parents as part of this communication process. We want our parents to know what the child is doing, what kind of progress they're making, and when you take a running record and you take a look at the guided reading and you have parent conferences, show them a guided reading book. Show them, this is what my child is reading. If you just give them a number, that might be a little nebulous to them. If you actually show them what that number means in a text and then show them what kind of progress they're making, we want to always keep our parents informed about our students' progress. Okay, now a running record is not as scary as it may sound. Okay, it really is. It's actually a lot of fun to do. Over the years, if you've been in the area of reading, you've always taken a look at informal reading inventories, miscue analysis. Running record is basically the same idea as an informal reading inventory or miscue analysis. All you're doing is you're taking a record of the child's oral reading. The child is reading a passage to you, and as the child is reading a passage to you, you are marking the types of error that the child is making. Now, it may sound a little technical, but we'll go through the different kinds of errors a child can make that we actually have to mark and that count as errors. But then we'll take a look at some other things that we really should note as a child is making, as a child is reading, because we want to take a look at what they're saying when they are making an error, because this tells us what kind of reader the child is. So if we take a look at here, the first type of error a child can make is a substitution, and I'll go through and I'll explain a substitution, but basically if they're putting one word in for another, and we'll go through a couple examples. The next kind of error that we actually mark is an insertion. If a child reads a sentence and adds an extra word, we call that an insertion, and we indicate that. The next one is an omission, and what an omission is if a child is reading a sentence and then leaves out a word, we indicate that. And the last error that we mark is a teacher told. And what that means is if a child is reading a selection and comes across a word they don't know, and they'll try to figure out how to sound the word out or what that word might mean. But sometimes if it's taking them a very long time, we'll give them some wait time. Eventually they might appeal to the teacher, and the teacher will have to tell them what the word is. So those are our 4 basic errors that we mark: a substitution, an insertion, an omission, and a teacher told. Now, there's some other things that a child may do when they are reading that do not count as errors, and I just want to go over that. If they're sounding out a word, that's very good. Before they say a word, they might sound it out, but that's not considered an error, because that is the cueing system that they're using, and again, we'll go over that. If they repeat a person's name, for example, Mary instead of May, we'll count that as an error one time, but if they keep making that error continuously, it would only count as an error one time. And when you tell a child a word, as I said before, a teacher told, that is an error. When we take a running record, what you'll see is you'll have the actual script that the child is reading in front of you. And as the child is reading, if they are reading it accurately, what you will do is just put little check marks, sometimes we call them ticks. Every time they say the word correctly, we just put the little check marks above it. If a child is substituting one word for another word, what you'll see is the actual text underneath it, and then whichever word they're substituting, you need to write down what the word is on the line above it so that we can analyze after what they're actually substituting, and that will give us an indication as to what kind of error and what kind of attempt the child is making. The next is what we call, as I said before, a teacher told. If a child does not know the word and has several different attempts and then eventually appeals to the teacher, we would just put a line over it and we'll mark it with a T, and the T will indicate that the teacher had to tell them the answer. The next thing is if the child wants to appeal to the teacher and the teacher wants the child to keep trying it, they might say, you try it. We'll mark that with an A and we'll say that the child made an attempt. They might make it a different attempt. We'll keep marking that, and eventually the child might get it, and if they do get it, we'll just use the little check mark, and if the teacher had to tell them, then we'll mark the T for told. If the child omits the word, all we have to do is the text is written underneath it, and then right above it we'll just put like a blank, and that'll mean that the child omitted it. If the child inserted a word, we can use a little caret, or we can just write the word above it where they inserted it. Now the next part, repetitions, it is very, very good for a child when they're reading and they've read something and they realize that it doesn't really make sense and they want to go back and they repeat it. That is a very good strategy the child is using. It is not an error. But in our running record, we want to indicate that, because as a teacher, we can see that this child is really using those early reading strategies that have been taught, and they know it doesn't make sense. So they go back and repeat it because they're trying to make it make sense. So when we want to indicate that the child is repeating it, we can mark it with the letter R, and if they've repeated the entire line, we'll just put a little bracket over it to where they started repeating it. If they only repeat the one word, we just put the R right next to the word they repeated. If they repeat it 2 times, we'll indicate how many times. But as I said, this may sound a little technical, but we'll go through it when we take a running record together. Okay, the last thing, which is not an error but is also very good, is what we call a self-correction. Now, what a self-correction means is the child has read a passage, he may have used one word, substituted one word for another, but as he's reading, he realizes that the word that he substituted didn't make sense, so he'll go back and he'll self-correct it, and we mark it as a self-correction with an SC, as you can see here, but it does not count as an error. Again, that is a child who's becoming a very good strategic reader, because that child is not making, he realizes that he made the error, and he knew as he read on it didn't make sense, so he went back to self-correct it. This is a little easier version of the coding system. Whichever works easier, whichever works best for you is perfectly fine to use. We have technical ones that I'm showing you, but as a teacher, when you start taking running records and you're doing it every single day on a child, it's going to become second nature to you, and you're going to start developing your own shorthand. But I just wanted to show you a couple of different ways that you can do it. We'll start off and we'll take a look at how we mark it here. If the child read it correctly, we do the same thing as I said before. We put little ticks, we check them off. If the child is sounding out a word, what we'll do is every time they sound it out, we'll write down what their attempts are. For example, this child for hospital was saying has, then became horse. Whatever the child said, whatever their sounding out was, we want you to write that down, because this will show me the kind of reader that the child is. If the child is substituting one word for another, you want to make sure that you write the word they substituted. In this particular case, the child said won't for went, so we want to write down the word won't. The next one is an omission. Again, the correct text is underneath it, and if they omitted the word, we'll just put a slash mark, a hyphenated. Okay, for insertion, we write the word that they inserted. We'll draw a line, or you can use a little caret, which you'll see later on. Again, now for the repetition, remember, this does not count as an error. If the child has repeated what we'll do is we'll indicate all of the words that the child repeated, and we'll put like a little arrow, as you can see on your sheets, of all the places the child repeated. And then for the self-correction, the child said won't instead of went when they read the text, and then they realized it was incorrect and they went back and they self-corrected. We just mark that with an SC. Okay, so those are all of the different ways to code the running record. There are questions that might arise as you're taking a running record, okay? And I just want to take a little bit of time to go through this. Okay, first thing, when the child's taking a running record, and as you'll see, we make those little tick marks as we're going across. And we'll add up all of those at the end of the line to see if there's an error or not. And we'll have a column where we indicate the errors and the self-corrections. If the child had a substitution, an omission, or an insertion, remember they count as an error. So just to review again, if they said house instead of home, that's an error. If they omitted the word home, that's an error. If they inserted big, that's an error. Okay, our next, if a child had multiple attempts to try one word, for example, if the word was home, they said house, they said here, they said her, we're not marking those as 3 errors. It's only 1 error because those are multiple attempts on one particular word. So they couldn't get home. They tried 3 different words. It didn't work for them, but it still counts as 1 error. If they tried all those words, house, here, her, and then eventually got the word home, that's where we'll mark the SC because they self-corrected. A proper noun. A proper noun is only counted as an error 1 time, and that's, as I mentioned earlier, if they substituted the word Mary for the word May and they kept doing it throughout the text, we don't code it as an error every single time. We code it once, and that's only for a proper noun. Okay, the next one, if a word is mispronounced due to a speech problem or a dialect, you might want to code it, but it's not an error. We don't penalize students for having a different dialect. Repetitions. They're coded, as I said before, and it depends. The coding, if they only repeat 1 word, we'll just put an R. If they repeated the 2 words, we'll put an R2. If they repeated the whole line, that's when we have to make the bracket and indicate the whole line that was repeated. The next one, number 7, weights are coded but not errors. That's when a child is reading a text and they come across a word they might not know, and they might wait a little bit because as they're trying to figure out in their head what that word is. They might wait, and we might want to code that with a W. We don't count that as an error. It just kind of tells us the child is using his cueing systems to really try and make meaning. Okay, for number 8, as we talked about before, if the child is sounding out a letter in a word, we don't count it as an error, but I want you to mark what he is sounding out. So if he's sounding, the word is take, they're starting to sound out t, a, put the T down, and then check with your little tick mark that he did get take. The next one, number 9, try that again. We only use that if the child, we don't want you, if the child keeps having multiple attempts and he doesn't get the word and he tries it again, we only count that 1 time. Every time they try it is not an additional error. And if the teacher for number 10 actually winds up having to tell the child the word, we want you to mark that with a T so we know that the teacher did tell the child the word. Now for number 11, if a child appeals to the teacher for a word, that again is counted as an error. We can mark down in our area here, that's not a self-correction because the teacher actually had to tell them what the word was. We'll mark down here that the teacher told them, and we actually write down the error that the child made, which is home for house. Okay, for number 12, as I said before, self-corrections, those are not errors. Even if they asked the teacher, they appealed to the teacher, if they eventually went back and self-corrected it, it is not an error. Number 13, contractions, I'll, I will, that only counts as 1 error even though it's 2 words. And again, these are little technical things that might arise as you're taking a running record. And just keep this page here as a reference page for you when you're doing the running record, because these are things I'm telling you now, but as you start experiencing it, you're going to kind of forget what I said. So keep this page at hand. Number 14 is an insertion. If a child inserts a word, as I said before, it counts as an error. Now, if a child inserts 2 words or inserts a whole sentence, unfortunately, they all count as errors. So, for example, if the child inserted the big house, that's 1 error. But if he said the very big house, very and big he inserted, that would be 2. If he puts in a whole sentence, every single one of those has to count as an error. That usually doesn't happen, but it is something that you should note. If the child is inventing the text, you can just indicate that on the top of the page, and again, that only counts as 1 error. Unfortunately, for number 16, if they skip an entire line as they're doing a running record, every single word that they skipped does count as an error. So make sure that the child is not skipping lines, because we really don't want to hold this against them if they've just kind of like lost their place. If they skip an entire page, which I've never seen happen in all my years of doing a running record, because as a teacher you're going to be right near the student, you would have to count all of those as an error. Okay, for number 18, again, the sounding out, just as an indication for you, if you want to write it in lowercase letters, for example, not, they sounded out n, ah, t. Write it in lowercase, separate it with a little hyphen so that the child is, so you can actually see that that was sounding out. For number 19, this is a little different. Sometimes, and again, in very rare cases, you might get a child that spells a word instead of says the word. So if they spell the word not, we like to indicate that with caps instead of lowercase, because that'll indicate for the teacher as you're analyzing the record that the child spelled the word out to the teacher and not sounded the word out. But number 20 is something that I want you to really keep in mind. When in doubt, give the child the benefit of the doubt. We are not trying to penalize students with running records. As a teacher, and you're doing running records a lot in your classroom, your students are going to be very comfortable with this process. In the beginning, they might be a little nervous, but as you keep doing it, it'll be second nature to you, it'll be second nature to the child, so the child won't feel that this is like a testing situation. They'll be very comfortable, they know that they're going to be reading to you, you might be marking some things, and they don't feel threatened. But we are not, again, trying to penalize students. If you're not sure, give the benefit to the child. Don't go there and just try to mark as many errors as you can. Okay, now this is another chart that I want you to keep on hand. When we are taking a running record and we're marking the errors for the students, there's a formula that we have to figure out the accuracy rate. If you take a look at this chart, we'll go through and I'll explain how to figure out the child's level. Basically, what we're looking for is we have the easy level, which is the child's independent level. Then we have the instructional level, which is the level that you're looking for, which is the level that you're teaching the child at. And then we have what it's called hard, or also referred to as the frustration level. This material is clearly too difficult for the child, so you wouldn't want to be using material at the child's frustration level or hard level. And just little coding systems, RW, that's running words. Running words means in the text, how many words are they actually reading? Okay, you count them up. Then you have E, those are errors. As we went over before, all the different errors that you've coded, that will be counting in a column that says E. You'll indicate all of those errors. And if a child self-corrects, we have another column that says SC, and that stands for self-corrections. Now, how do we figure this out? You might want to have your little calculator on hand. Sometimes I always like to check myself with the calculator, but basically what we do is we identify how many running words are in the selection. In an example here, our selection has 150 running words. If the child made 15 errors, we divide the running words by how many errors, so it would be 150 divided by 15, and that would give you 10. So we use the ratio 1 to 10. And if you take a look at your chart up here, and you find where 1 to 10 is on the chart, it will tell you, if you go over to the percentage column, that the child is reading with 90% accuracy. Now, 90% accuracy, as you can see, falls in the instructional level. So this would be an appropriate text to use with the child for their instructional level. Sometimes these numbers kind of seem, what does that mean, 1 to 10? What's that ratio mean? And basically, in layman's term, it means the child is making an error every 10 words that he reads. So 1 to 10, he was making an error every 10 words. 1 to 11.75, every time they read approximately, 11.75, every time they read 12 words. So that's if you want to relate it back to it. And if you take a look up here at the easy portion, if they had 95% accuracy, they're only making an error 1 out of every 20 words that they read. So that makes a little more sense to you, hopefully. All right, now the other part, there's a little formula down here, which you can see. But again, it's very basic. Just take your running words, divide it by your number of errors, get your ratio, and go up to that chart and see what your accuracy rate is. If you want to multiply it out, there is a formula down there that you can use. Now, we also indicate self-corrections. However, we don't really indicate the self-correction rate, but if we wanted to, and I don't want to get that technical on the first time that I'm teaching you running records, when we do more in-depth running record training, we can talk a little bit more about self-correction. There is a way to figure out the self-correction rate, but it is here for you. So I don't want to get you bogged down. So just let's review how we accurately figure out the child's accuracy rate. We'll take the running words, divide it by the number of errors, put that in our ratio. So if it's 150 words divided by 15 errors, that would be 10. So our ratio would be 1 to 10. Go over to the chart, find 1 to 10, look at the accuracy rate, 90%, so the child is reading with 90% accuracy. Okay, I think we're probably all ready and to figure out how to mark our running records. Now, before we begin to mark our running records, you probably heard me refer to earlier strategies that the students are using and the cueing systems that the students are using. And I want to just explain what we mean when we talk about cueing systems and how important this is when we're taking a running record. As I said earlier, we're not just taking a running record to figure out, how many mistakes a child can make. We're really trying to analyze the kind of mistakes the child is making because it tells us what kind of reader that the child is. If we take a look here at the cueing systems, there's basically 3 of them. And I have this in script form, but I also have it in a visual, which I'm going to show you next for the visual learners that we are, like I am. It makes it a little easier. But there's 3 different cueing systems that a child can use. There's the meaning, also known as semantic. There's the structure, also known as syntactic. And our third cueing system is the visual or the graphophonic cueing system. And I think that's the one we're probably the most familiar with because we always relate that back to phonics. Now, what do these all mean? In the meaning cueing system, what a child is doing when they substitute one word for another, and we're going to go through a few examples, is the word that they've substituted actually makes sense in the sentence. For example, home for house. It would probably make sense in that sentence. So we call that the semantic cueing system or meaning because the child is using meaning to figure it out. The structure or the grammar, that's the syntactic cueing system. The child is actually substituting, and the easiest way to remember this is grammar part of speech. They'll substitute a noun for a noun or a verb for a verb, and it might make sense in that sentence, it might not, but they're at least substituting the correct part of speech. And then the last one is the visual or the graphophonic, and usually what students do with this cueing system is that they will substitute a word phonetically. For example, boy for ball, they start with the same word. It won't make sense in the story, but they're using their initial consonant sound b and trying to substitute one word in for another, even though it doesn't make sense. Now, I have a graphic which I think might make it a little clearer to understand the cueing systems. And these are kind of questions and again, little notes that you can ask yourself as you're trying to figure out and analyze a child's running record. Now remember, this is the part that comes after. First, we'll practice after. We're going to take an actual running record. And after we take the running record, which you're going to use that coding system that I just went over, then we're going to take the next step and we're going to actually analyze it. And these are the cueing systems. So I don't want you to get confused between actually taking the running record and analyzing it. I'm explaining both of them now. Okay, let's go over the meaning again. Meaning, as I said before, is called semantic. And the question that you'll ask yourself is, does it make sense? And if we just take a look here, they need to have story sense, prior knowledge, text, illustrations. These are all things that students have in place to figure out if the word will make sense. So if they have a sense of what's happening in the story, they're going to use this cueing system. If they have some prior knowledge, they're going to use this cueing system. If they pretty much understand the text, it'll be the cueing system they refer to. And again, in this particular one, illustrations, especially when we're working with lower level emergent readers or early readers, the illustrations in the text will really help the child figure out, does it make sense? So that's the question that you ask yourself. In the structural or the syntactic cueing system, what we're asking ourselves is, does it sound right? Are we using natural language? We'll take a look at their knowledge of English and, again, grammatical patterns and language structures. This is usually the one you can easily identify with noun for noun, verb, for example, walk for fly. That's where that will fall in. We don't usually use this cueing system in isolation. Usually the child will use the meaning system in conjunction with the structural, but we'll go through that also. Okay, and the last one and the most common one, and I'm not sure, in your districts or where you come from, I think that we've done a lot of work teaching students how to sound out words. So we're going to find out and actually we found out like in our district, our students really rely heavily on this visual or graphophonic cueing system because they're going to be asking themselves, does it look right? They have this sound symbol correspondence going on, b, k, d. They know the initial consonant sounds, and they're always going to try and substitute the initial consonant sounds because that's what they're familiar with. They might make analogies. The other big key here is print conventions. In the visual, this is what we teach our students. I'm not sure if anybody uses Concepts About Print by Marie Clay when students are in kindergarten first learning how to read. We take a look at things as directionality, the spacing between the words, the letters, the beginning and the ending of the line, of the page, and also punctuation. So these are our three cueing systems: meaning, structure, and visual. Now what I'd like to do is give you some examples of the actual cueing systems. If we take a look first, the first cueing system is the structure cueing system we're going to talk about. If the text actually reads, "I like to see horses at the farm," and the child substitutes the word fly, "I like to fly horses at the farm," what the child is doing is actually using their structural or syntactic cueing system because they're substituting a verb for a verb, fly for see, which is the right part of speech. It doesn't fit in the sentence it doesn't fit in the context of a story, but it actually fits grammar-wise. So we would take a look at, on our chart, well, you'll see the running record, you'll have a column that says cues used, and that will be your error column, and you'll see M, S, and V. If the child is making a meaning correction, we will circle the M. In this case, where the child is using their structural system, we circled the S. And if they're using their visual or graphophonic, we'll circle the V. The most common cueing system I think that students use all the time is the visual cueing system. And let me give you an example. If the text says, "I like to see horses at the farm," the child might substitute the word hears for horses. Now, if you take a look at their substitution, it might look similar. If you take a look at the word hears and you take a look at the word horses, starts with the same beginning letter, has an R, an E, an S, but it doesn't sound right and it's not acceptable in the English sentence. It also doesn't make sense in the sentence because it doesn't make meaning. You wouldn't say, "I like to see hears at the farm." So what the child is clearly using is the visual cueing system because they're substituting a word that might look like or sound like that word, but it doesn't make sense in the sentence and it's not grammatically correct in that sentence. Now let's take a look at the meaning cueing system. Sometimes students use, as I said before, more than one cueing system, and here's an example. In the text, the text reads, "I like to see horses at the farm." But if you had the text actually in front of you, what you would see is pictures of horses or colts there, and what the child substituted was ponies for horses. Now, even though the substitution doesn't look the same, P, H, they're not using their visual cueing system, they are substituting ponies for horses, which is a structural because they're substituting a noun for a noun, but that's also going to make sense in the story. It makes meaning. So they're using their meaning cueing system because actually what they were doing is they were looking at the picture of the horses and the colts and they used the word ponies instead of horses. So this child is actually using two of their cueing systems, the meaning and the syntactic cueing system. In another example, "I like to see horses at the farm." The child substituted houses for horses. Again, if we take a look at that, that would actually make sense visually because the H's, they both start with ow, and so the child would be sounding that word out, but the word houses doesn't make sense. But if they substituted houses for horses, again, it's a noun for a noun, so they would be using the visual and the syntactic cueing system. So hopefully with examples that'll explain it a little better. All right, now before we begin to take our running record, I just want to go over a good reader and what some characteristics of a good reader are, because we want to keep this in mind as we're, again, taking a running record and looking at our cueing systems. A good reader concentrates, what they try to do is they try to construct meaning as they're reading, and they take a look at all the words and they try to identify them correctly, but as they're doing this, they are making meaning, they're not just reading words. The other thing that good readers do is they will always use their prior knowledge and make a prediction about what might happen and what might be coming up next in the text. If students have prior knowledge, this is always very helpful when they're reading because they can bring something to the actual literature. And they also, it's very key as a teacher to have them make predictions. What do you think is going to happen next? Because usually if they're making predictions or are pretty familiar with the text with some prior knowledge, they will make less errors because they actually have a very good idea of what's happening in the story, and so they will constantly be trying to make meaning. And the other thing that really, really good readers do is they monitor comprehension. And if they're reading a story, and if they're like a word-by-word reader and they're reading it, and they notice that they've kind of lost the meaning, then they'll stop doing what they're doing and just reading these words, and they'll go back and they'll stop, and that's where that self-correction comes in, and they'll try to go back and restore the meaning that they're losing. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to show you what an actual running record sheet looks like. I'm showing you a blank sheet without the text, but when we do this for practice, when we'll start, we'll have the text there because it's a lot easier to take a running record. But there's some key areas I want you to take a look at. This is a sample of a running record sheet that we have created here in New Haven that makes it easier for us. But Maury Clay has plenty of running record sheets. If you take informal reading inventories, you'll see their running record sheets. They all look a little different, but they all basically tell you the same things. First of all, we want to know what text level the child was reading at, and I'm not sure if you're using DRA levels, running record levels, whatever you're using for your guide as your level text, you would indicate that. This section here for scores, if you remember way back when we talked about how to score a running record, we put the number of words, how many words there were, and we divided it by how many errors. And remember, it was 150 words divided by 15 errors, that was 10. So in our error rate, we put 1 to 10. And we looked at a little chart, and the chart indicated that the accuracy was 90%, so we indicated that. And again, at this point, we're not going to talk about the self-correction rate, but there is a spot for there if you want it. Now, as we go through and we analyze the errors, we're going to decide, was the text easy, which is, we put easy there, but that also means independent level. Was it at their instructional level, or was it at the hard level or the frustration level? And if you use the example I just did, 150 divided by 15, 90% accuracy, we would check off this box here because that would be their instructional level. The next part, which is just again a reminder for you, we have, after we decide what all the errors are, we need to analyze our errors. Meaning, if they're making a meaning error, that'll be coded with an M. If they're making a structural or syntactic, an S, and a visual, a V. And then here, we would put down their accuracy score, which would have been 90% again. And we're not going to go over this portion of it today, but we always also give our students a retell. We have them tell us what the story was about, and we use a 4-point rubric. And at a later date, if we want to go over how to do a retell, we can go over that. But we also, it's very important to find out if the child was able to comprehend the story. Now, just to take a look at this blank sheet here, as I said, we always indicate the page, and you'll see the script written here. But this column here, E, stands for error. However many errors they made in that particular row, we'd indicate. The next column, SC, stands for self-correction. If they made a self-correction, we put a little 1. Then we take a look at the next two columns. What was the information? The kind of error that they made. Was it an M, S, or V error? And in our column here, we'll mark down if it's M, S, or V. And the self-correction, again, we're going to decide, did they use MSV? Which cueing system did they use? It's a part that is a little more difficult when we're analyzing to try and figure out, but it's very important because, again, just marking errors doesn't help us with the child. We know that they've made errors, but analyzing the kind of errors is the key point. Before we take a writing record, I just want to review, because it's been a little while since we went over the errors, what were the errors that we're marking for. The first error is a substitution. Now remember, if a child makes a substitution error, what you're going to see is the actual text. It might be house, and if they substituted the word home for house, you'd write it on the top of the line. Okay? The next is insertion. If a child added a word, you can use a little caret and indicate the word. Maybe they'll write the word big, so you can use a little caret as your insertion. The next is an omission. If a child leaves out a word, and again the word was house, just put a little slash or a little blank line along across the word. And the last one is the teacher told. Again, if the word was house, you wait a little time, the child may have had some attempts but really didn't want to figure it out at all, and they really appealed to the teacher, we just can put a T above that. That means the teacher told. So those are the 4 errors we're looking for: substitutions, insertions, omissions, and teacher told. Remember, we're going to indicate if they repeated a line, if they sound out a word. All of that will be indicated in our running record. But these are the only ones that count for errors. Now, what I want to do is get ready, have everyone ready. We're going to read a short piece of text. You're going to be the student, I'm going to be the teacher, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the selection for you, and what you're going to do as I'm reading is you're actually going to mark the errors, and I'll keep this on the overhead so you can constantly refer to it. But remember, what I tell you is the kind of like the technical, but you can develop your own shorthand for, you know, filling in the substitutions and the insertions and the omissions and the teacher told. This story is entitled, What a Mess. All set? That's a mess, said Auntie Jean. I will fix it all, said Mr. Keen. I'll fix your stairs and fix the chairs. I'll fix your doors. I'll fix your doors. And then fix your floors. I'll fix your walls. And I'll fix your halls. And I'll fix your halls. Help, please, said Mr. Keen. What a mess, cried Auntie Jean. Okay, now what I'd like to do is go over all the errors that you marked, and we're going to go over and we're going to decide what kind of errors we made, and then after we'll go through and analyze them. Okay, in the first line, line 2, what a mess, said Auntie Jean. First thing I did, instead of using the word what, I substituted it for the word that's. So that would be an error. So in the E column, we'll put a little 1 for error. The next error that I made is instead of saying the word Jean, I said Jan. But then I self-corrected myself and said Jean, so we'd put an SC. And instead of marking it in the E column, we mark that in our SC column. Okay, now if we take a look at the next line, I'll fix it all, said Mr. Keen. What I did was, instead of saying I'll, I said I will. So that's 1 error, so we'll mark the E column with a 1. Okay, next line, I'll fix your stairs and I'll fix your chairs. I omitted the second I'll, so I've just put a line above I'll, and again, mark a 1 in the error column. Then instead of saying your chairs, I said the chairs. So that's another error, so we'll put another 1 in the tally column. Now for line 5, I said I'll fix your doors, then I repeated it. So if you remember, when you repeat it, we put a little bracket, we go over all of the words that I repeated, and I'll just mark it with a little R. If you recall, that does not count as an error, but we do mark it on our students' running record script because we want to be aware that the child at this point is probably making meaning if he figures out what he said does not make sense. And then I substituted the word then for aisle. Okay, now in line 6, I said, I'll fix your wallpaper. But then I realized I made an error in wallpaper, so I self-corrected myself. So I put an SC, and I indicate that in the SC column. Okay, now if we go down, at the end of that sentence, it says, and I'll fix your halls. Again, I repeated myself, so we'll put a line over, and I'll fix your halls, and put an R at the end. Again, that does not count as an error, but I went back and repeated it. I want to indicate that on my running record. In line 7, I said, help, please. So I substituted please for help. That's an error, so I'll mark that in the error column. And then in the last line, what a mess, said Auntie Jean. Instead of saying the word said, I said cried. And again, that's an error, so I'll mark that in the error column. Now what I want to do is I want to take a look at our MSV column, because what we want to do is we want to analyze the types of errors that the students made, and we want to be able to see if we can analyze if they're using their meaning, structural, or visual cueing system. Okay, the first one, that's a mess instead of what a mess. What cueing system do you think we're using? That's correct, meaning, because we're not losing the meaning. So the substituting that's for what would be an M, so I'd mark an M in that column. Okay, for my self-correction, I said Jan instead of Jean. I'm using my visual cueing system, because if I look at Jan and I look at Jean, J is there, the A is there, the N is there. So I would mark the V in my self-correct column. Okay, down to line 3 where I substituted I will for I'll. I did not lose meaning when I did that. I will fix it all. So this error is a meaning error. So we put an M in the error column. I'll fix your stairs, and I omitted I'll. Usually when there's an omission, we don't usually have to mark if it's an MSV, because they actually omitted the word, so we can't decide what they would have said. So if there's an omission, we just leave it alone. But the next one says the. I'll fix your stairs, and I'll fix the chairs. That would make sense in the sentence, so I would use M in that column because we made meaning. I didn't lose meaning. Okay, in line 5, again, the repetition does not count as an error, but I indicated. But then I said, it says, I'll fix your doors and then fix your floors. So in this case, again, I used meaning. The next row, row 6, I'll fix your wallpaper. That was a self-correction. Instead of walls, it said wallpaper. And for that one there, we could probably use the visual, but also meaning. So we're probably using 2 cueing systems there to self-correct. And again, just as a reminder, self-corrections are what we're looking for. Okay, row 7. Help, please, said Mr. Keene. Again, I substituted please for help, but I made meaning. So in the error column, I would use the meaning cueing system. And last one, what a mess, cried Auntie Jean. Instead of using said, I said cried. Again, I was using meaning. So if you take a look at this child's running record and you analyze, you'll notice that this child here really is a child who makes meaning while they're reading. And the cueing system, when you analyze the running record, you try to figure out what cueing systems do they rely on. And this is actually a very good reader because he relies on his meaning cueing system. So this particular child would actually need more work in phonics or graphophonic, because a lot of the words, even though they made sense in the story, if you took a look at them, for example, cried for said, you could never, the child who has good phonics background would know that they could not substitute cried for said, because said starts with s and cried starts with the blend. So it's very important to analyze a child's running record so you can see if they're making meaning or not. Okay, now what we need to do is go through our column and count up how many errors a child made. So let's look at our E column and count it up. We'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 errors. Mark that down. In self-correct, we had 2. Now, if we go up to the top of our page, remember our formula. We did running words divided by errors. So if you took a look at the running words, they had 51 running words, and you divided it by 7. So if you have your calculators out at your desks now, if you divide 51 by 7, you get approximately 7, so your error rate is 1 to 7. Now I want you to take a look and go back at your conversion chart and see where 1 to 7 falls on your conversion chart, what the accuracy rate would be. 85.5% accuracy rate. And remember, we're not going to do the self-correction now. Now, if they have an 85.5% accuracy rate, would this material that they're reading be too easy for them? Would it be at their instructional level, or would it be too difficult? And remember, the easy range is independent, which is 95% or better accuracy. Instructional is 90 to 94, and frustration would be 50 to 89. Okay, it would be very hard, okay? So we could check off that this material would be too difficult for them, so it would not be material that we want to use. And again, on our chart, we'll mark 85.5% accuracy rate. And when you're doing this in class, make sure on the text level you indicate this particular story, what a mess, what the text level was. And at a later time, we will work on using our rubric to do the retell score. But what we would do from this point on is actually have the child tell us what the story was about. And that's another dimension to the taking the running record. I hope you enjoyed your session today. Working with the running record might be a little difficult to do, but as you keep doing it, it'll get easier and easier every time. But I think you can see how important it is to take a running record of your child's reading. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to call. I'll leave my card with Dr. Brown, and you can, don't hesitate to call. I'll be very happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your patience today.